Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination made an extreme impact on society. He was a powerful leader in the civil rights movement with his peaceful boycotts of nonviolent tactics, while also being a Baptist minister and founder of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. With King's controversial topics of speech and powerful use of words advocating racial equality, he appealed to many racial backgrounds, but also angered a great majority. King worked to speak out against other issues during this time in America, such as the Vietnam War, and also called to form a coalition within the races to address unemployment and poverty. He organized a Poor People's Campaign to focus on the issue, including an interracial Poor People's March on Washington, and in March of 1968 traveled to Memphis in support of poorly treated African American sanitation workers. King had become increasingly more concerned with the status of economic equality months before his assassination. On the night of April 3rd, King gave a speech at the Mason Temple Church in Memphis. In it, he seemed to foreshadow his own untimely passing.
On April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, Martin Luther King Jr., also known as the Apostle of Nonviolence, was assassinated. The day before, King arrived in Memphis to attend a strike supporting better working conditions. On the same day, he gave his final sermon, which almost foreshadowed his death the next day. Many remember him saying, "We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter to me now, because I've seen the mountaintop, and he's allowed me to go up the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get the promised land." The next day at 6:05 p.m., King stood on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel, where he was struck in his jaw/neck region. The bullet severed his spinal cord and was pronounced dead 30 minutes later at the St. Joseph Hospital in Memphis. He was only 39. Later on that evening, a .306 hunting rifle was found on a sidewalk 1 block away from the Lorraine Motel. Authorities also discovered a scope and a pair of binoculars in the bathroom of the building where Ray shot the bullet. After doing some tests and inspecting fingerprints, the FBI confirmed that the murderer was James Earl Ray, an Illinois-born man and a confirmed racist.
Before the assassination, James Earl Ray was an American soldier stationed in West Germany. During his time overseas, he was charged with drunkenness and breaking arrest. Ray was eventually discharged for ineptness and lack of adaptability for service in December of 1948. After the discharge, Ray embarked on a life of odd jobs and jail sentences. For example, he worked for the Dryden Rubber Company in Chicago until he was laid off in September of 1949, and then left for Los Angeles. On October 11th, he was arrested for robbing a cafe and was sentenced to 90 days imprisonment. It was noted that leading up to the assassination, it is highly probable that Ray stalked King prior to the shooting. In March of 1968, Ray submitted a postal change of address card with the forwarding address of Atlanta, Georgia, Dr. King's home city, before leaving California.
To further confirm the accusation, witnesses saw Ray running from the boarding house carrying a bundle. Soon after the assassination, riots broke out in lots of cities, allowing the president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, to deploy National Guard troops to Memphis and Washington, D.C. 5 days after his death, MLK was laid to rest in his hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. Tens of thousands of people lined the streets for 3.5 miles to pay tribute to King. His body was brought to Southview Cemetery, which was found by former slaves in 1886. His casket was later brought to the King Center after it was built. Surprisingly, not a single violent incident occurred at the procession. MLK's assassination led to an outpouring of anger among Black Americans, as well as a period of national mourning that helped speed the way for an equal housing bill that would be the last significant legislative achievement of the Civil Rights era.
Consumed with fear, James Earl Ray fled the U.S. to Canada in attempts to escape both persecution, penalization, and fear of being on the top 10 most wanted list due to the assassination of King. The arresting of Ray in London stopped him in his tracks from fulfilling his plan to travel to Belgium and then to his end destination of Rhodesia, now known as Zimbabwe. Ray was taken to court in Memphis during March of 1969, where he pleaded guilty to the crimes of King's assassination. His final sentencing was concluded in death by electric chair. JFK's widowed wife and children spoke out for Ray, claiming him innocent and that his guilt was a conspiracy of the government and military, although he had already confessed guilt. They said that he was paid to carry out the act, having ample amounts of resources consisting of ammunition and money. This conspiracy would have supported the record that he had never participated in political hatred, thus clearing his name of guilt. However, without clear evidence to support this hypothesis, he was prosecuted and blamed for King's death. His death to the black community was a symbol that their fights and right to equality was being pushed aside and made their will to fight back grow stronger than ever before. During this time, the combination of King and Malcolm X's death radicalized the intentions behind the civil rights movement for many black Americans. This newly founded fuel to fight led to the development of the Black Power movement as well as the Black Panther Party from the 60s on into the 70s. Ultimately, the assassination of King would continue the fight for equal treatment and rights of all men and women, black or white, both within the United States and overseas.
James Earl Ray was sentenced to prison for 99 years. In other words, prison would become home for the rest of his life.
The conditions of state penitentiaries and prisons during the time surrounding the 1960s were consistently viewed as inhumane and not meeting up to standards of basic human rights, whether a prisoner or not. Incarceration of criminals' sole purpose is to punish them for actions in which they have taken. However, this rides a fine line of what is considered punishment or cruelty. In 1955, the publication of the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for Treatment of Prisoners was released. At this time, rehabilitation, learning, socialization, and activity were slowly being introduced to prisons. This document recognized many basic rights of prisoners and helped modernize prison ethics of today, making conditions more humane. Due to prisoner abuse, prison riots became more and more frequent. Additionally, prison rights were severely tipped towards whites as opposed to Hispanic or black prisoners, which has continued into modern day. According to prison history, African Americans have historically always had a different set of institutions and punishments controlling their behavior. Today, many African Americans feel that the disproportionate jailing of people of color shows that this history of separate and unequal treatment at the hands of the law is far from over. Common activity within prisons include beatings, rape, robberies, riots, as well as denied access to proper medical and psychiatric care. Rat and other pest infestations are also a common quality in prisons, such as the East Mississippi Correctional Facility. Multiple standards have been set since the 1950s that should prohibit these standards of living, yet they are not followed through. For example, in the 1970s, new judicial standards were put into place to correct conditions being made for prisoners. This intersected with new crimes as well as sentencing laws and a rapidly growing population. The standards intended to alter this rise and reduce rates of overcrowding, as well as improve chances of rehabilitation for prisoners. Since 1980, prisons have continually been built in remote locations away from most civilians and have become a place where prisoners are to live without optimism in their lives, future, and daily activities. These holdings are built for outrageous sums of criminals, thus needing to be in depressed and remote locations just to sustain its population. The rest of James Earl Ray's life would consist of experiencing all of these factors.
In recent years, inmate brutality has been a hot topic within jails and prisons. America makes up only 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the prison population. 65 million Americans have some form of criminal record. Therefore, there is plenty of evidence about inmate brutality. Numerous inmates have reported being beaten with fists and batons, stomped on, kicked, shot, stunned with electrical devices, doused with chemical sprays, choked, and slammed face first into concrete floors by the officers whose job it is to guard them. Inmates have ended up with broken jaws, smashed ribs, perforated eardrums, missing teeth, and burn scars. Inevitably, many psychological scars and emotional pain have been surfaced upon the inmates. As a result, many inmates have died due to these conditions. Both men and women prisoners, more especially women, face staff rape and sexual abuse. Correctional officers are known to bribe, coerce, or violently force inmates into granting sexual favors, including oral sex and intercourse. Prison staff have laughed at and ignored the pleas of male prisoners seeking protection from rape by other inmates. The Department of Justice's Inspector General recently reported on the abuse of Muslim men picked up after September 11th while detained at the Federal Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. This goes to show that there is discrimination within county jails and federal prisons still today, and that no one is truly safe. In many ways, prisons today are not so far off from those of the 1960s, consistently neglecting basic human rights.
It is evident that many of these laws are still not enforced today. Modern-day prisoners still lack lots of rights, especially the African American population. In the 1960s, there was close to 300,000 people in prison. That number has now reached 2.3 million, 1 million of these being African Americans. In 2001, 1 in 6 African American men had been in prison at some point in their lives. In more recent years, research has shown that African Americans and Hispanics made up 1/4 of the U.S. population, but comprised of 58% of all prisoners. If African Americans and Hispanics were imprisoned at the same rate as whites, today's prisons would decline by about 50%. A reason for this is because African Americans are incarcerated at nearly 6 times the rate of whites. In addition to brutality and inequality in prisons, the food also shows how rough prisons today truly are.
When asking others what first comes to mind when they hear prison food, most respond with disgusting, inedible, and nauseating. Ultimately, an unpleasant experience. No one expects the finest gourmet meals for America's yardbirds, but everyone should expect that they are fed enough portions to live. Many accounts of malnourishment are happening in sites such as the Gordon County Jail in Calhoun, Georgia. Inmates are starving. As the 2 meals a day aren't enough to sustain everyday life, some have resorted to eating toothpaste and toilet paper. It has also been reported that inmates in Montgomery County Jail in New York have been led to violent tendencies due to the meager portions of food among the inmates. One inmate reportedly lost 90 pounds in less than 6 months while serving time in the prison. Groups of prisoners in a county jail in Pennsylvania have filed federal civil rights lawsuits, claiming that their food portions are not enough to fill a 5-year-old child. Many could blame it on the budget-conscious legislatures in numerous states, having proposed reducing the minimum number of meals down to 2 per day. And so, prison officials are increasingly outsourcing food service to private contractors to slash food costs.
James Earl Ray, MLK's assassin, was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in confinement. Here he experienced the brutal prison conditions of the 1960s. Despite being 60 years ago, it is evident that prison conditions today are merely the same.